Good evening. My name is Tom Everett, and I am an undergraduate assistant at the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture. On behalf of David Solomon, director of the center, I would like to welcome you to this year's Catholic Culture Series. Every fall since 2002, the center has sponsored the Catholic Culture Series, a set of lectures focused on prominent figures in the Catholic literary tradition. The series sprang from the center's desire to expose Notre Dame undergraduates and the entire Notre Dame community to the richness of the Catholic literary heritage. Highlighting such major Catholic figures as Flannery O'Connor, G.K. Chesterton, Graham Greene, Walker Percy, and J.R.R. Tolkien, we at the Center hope to promote such writers both for the quality of their works and the uniquely Catholic dimension of their literary perspectives. Last autumn, the series examined the complex relationship between William Shakespeare and Catholicism in Elizabethan England. This year, the series focuses on 4 Catholic satirists: Evelyn Waugh, Baron Corvo, Hilaire Belloc, and Oscar Wilde. Since classical times, satire has been a keen weapon of criticism used by rhetoricians in Western civilization. Some of the greatest satirists of modern times have been Catholics. Yet, from the Catholic perspective, there are also reservations about whether satire is truly a meaningful instrument in a dialogue of evangelization. This year's series seeks to contribute to this debate by examining the critique of modern society which these 4 men offered through their satire. Mark your calendars for Tuesday, October 28th, when Father Charlie Gordon will join us here in this room to conclude the series. Tonight, we are privileged to welcome Professor Joseph Pearce to deliver an address on Oscar Wilde. Previously a radical activist and agnostic editor of 2 extremist magazines in Britain, an undeniable love of the work of G.K. Chesterton brought Pearce to the Catholic Church. He is now the author of several critically acclaimed best-selling biographies of great 19th and 20th century Christian authors, such as Chesterton, J.R.R. Tolkien, Oscar Wilde, Hilaire Belloc, C.S. Lewis, and most recently, William Shakespeare. He is also the co-founder and co-editor of an international magazine dedicated to reclaiming Catholic culture, and is writer-in-residence and assistant professor of literature at Ave Maria University in Naples, Florida. Please join me in welcoming Professor Pearce.
Thank you. I'll be right with you when we get the technology sorted out here. Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to say it's good to be back. It's always a delight to come back to Notre Dame in general, and certainly to be part of this particular lecture series organised by the Centre for Ethics and Culture. We certainly have an interesting selection of people that you've been hearing talks about this particular year, and all of them, I think, probably have a claim to being controversial. Baron Corvo perhaps isn't very well known, but now you know about him, you see how he's controversial. Hilaire Belloc certainly was no stranger to controversy, and Evelyn Waugh, similarly, no stranger to controversy. But I think that I'm not exaggerating if I say that Oscar Wilde is probably the one that's the most controversial of all. And I wrote my book, The Unmasking of Oscar Wilde, largely in frustration at the fact that nobody seems to be doing Oscar Wilde justice. And I'm thinking particularly not just objectively, and obviously ultimately justice is about objectivity, but subjectively in the sense that I don't think that Oscar Wilde himself would have felt that he had his reputation had been dealt with justly in the century since his death, 100 years, just over 100 years since his death. It seems to me these days that Oscar Wilde is either seen on the one side as a gay icon, as a sort of an icon of homosexuality, as maybe a sexual liberator, early pioneer of gay rights, etc. On the other extreme, he's sometimes looked upon as a decadent pariah, as someone who, because of his lifestyle, is someone that's an untouchable, that we should not talk about or read or spend any time with, we should just point the finger of scorn at. And it seems to me that Oscar Wilde has been the victim of both of these errors, the error of the prurient and the error of the Puritan. To the one, to the prurient, Wilde is a war cry, a battle cry. To the Puritan, he's a warning. To one a war cry, to the other a warning. One betrays Oscar Wilde with a kiss, and the other with a curse. It seems to me that Oscar Wilde has been caught between Judas and the Pharisee. And it's been my sort of hope that my own work would liberate him from the unwelcome clutches of either. Now, Oscar Wilde, in his essay De Profundis, said that the best way of understanding him was to see his art. It was through his art that he expressed himself most truly and most perceptively and insightfully. And one of the things, the great shame about that is that Oscar Wilde now is far better known for the scandal surrounding the libel trial and then his own trial related to his relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas, that his work has largely been eclipsed. Now, there's no doubt at all that Wilde would have been horrified by this. And Wilde's essay, De Profundis, is perhaps very, very valuable, because Wilde, as we know, rather beguilingly and sometimes infuriatingly, held a mask for much of his life. He concealed and revealed himself through the use of masks. That's why my book's called The Unmasking of Oscar Wilde. But the wonderful thing about De Profundis is there is no mask. First of all, he's in prison. Secondly, this is a private letter written to one person. He's not expecting ever to be published. Thirdly, he's broken. His health, spiritually and physically, has been broken by the experience of prison. When he writes De Profundis, he's wearing no masks. And that's why that particular essay, in many ways, is a key to understanding Oscar Wilde. And as part of my research, something very interesting, I went to the manuscripts room of the British Library in London, and I got access to the original manuscript of De Profundis that Wilde wrote in prison. And what's very interesting about that is that when he's writing about religion, the handwriting is very, very calm. And then the whole essay sort of oscillates between this calm meditation upon truth and this anger at Lord Alfred Douglas and his role in Wilde's downfall. And the handwriting itself goes from being very, very calm when he's talking about religion, talking about Christianity, talking about art, talking about the Renaissance, talking about all of these issues, and then it would just oscillate from there to a wild, florid, large handwriting attacking vituperatively his former friend, Lord Alfred Douglas. And again, this is a way in which we can really get a view into the heart of the real Oscar Wilde. And yet also De Profundis serves as a metaphor by the way in which the real Oscar Wilde is not addressed or not looked at by our culture. Because when De Profundis was first published, almost 100 years ago, early 20th century, all the reference to the scandal, all these angry parts of the letter were excised. They were removed. So what's left is this truncated letter where Oscar Wilde is seen to be sort of a serene, mystical meditator upon the truths of art, culture, and religion. And all of that's in there. But of course it's a distortion because it's leaving this other side out. And then on the centenary of Oscar Wilde's death back in 2000, I was part of some celebrations to commemorate that event at the National Theatre in London. And as part of the events that took place that weekend, there was a dramatic monologue by Corinne Redgrave. I don't know how many of you know Corinne Redgrave. It's a famous acting family. Michael Redgrave was his father. Vanessa Redgrave is his sister. But Corinne Redgrave has always been, like Vanessa Redgrave, a Marxist, has an extreme position. He's also always been very outspoken about his own homosexuality. But this dramatic monologue of De Profundis did the exact opposite of what happened 100 years earlier. All of the religion and all of the aesthetics, all of the serene meditation upon the deepest mysteries of life were left out. All that was left in was the anger, the bitterness, the vituperative approach toward Lord Alfred Douglas. And I watched this, and I just saw the metaphor. Poor Oscar Wilde. You know, one way or the other, no one seems to be understanding who the person was himself. So that was why I wrote my book. And also the enigma at the heart of Oscar Wilde, because why does the man who more than any other, in 19th and 20th century literature perhaps, epitomize decadence, an iconoclastic approach to conventional morality, why is it that this person is received into the Catholic Church on his deathbed? Now, as it was mentioned in the introduction, my own conversion to Catholicism was largely influenced by G.K. Chesterton. And one of the things about Chesterton that I really love was Chesterton's use of paradox. And of course, one of the major influences upon Chesterton's use of paradox was Oscar Wilde, who was, of course, in his own way, a master of paradox. But this paradox struck me. You have the man who is an untouchable pariah, who is received into the Catholic Church on his deathbed. What is that all about? What's the answer to that mystery? And that's what I said about trying to solve. I should add, by the way, that the evidence for Oscar Wilde's reception to the church, because there are elements, that are in denial about it, is without doubt. There were only two people present at Wilde's death. They didn't know each other beforehand, and as far as I'm aware, never met each other again afterwards. One was Robert Ross, Wilde's long-time friend, and one of the very few people to stand behind Oscar Wilde after his downfall, to stay loyal to him. Everybody else shunned him and left him. And the other was Father Cuthbert Dunn, who was the priest that Robert Ross went to get when Wilde was clearly approaching death. Those two people didn't know each other. Robert Ross, in his memoirs, makes it perfectly clear that Wilde was received into the church on his deathbed. Father Cuthbert Dunn, writing 50 years later, shortly before his own death, remembered this event. And basically his account of it parallels exactly Robert Ross's. So there's no doubt that Oscar Wilde was received into the Catholic Church on his deathbed. Now, was this a moment of madness? Was this something very different from who Oscar Wilde was? How could the cultural and sexual iconoclast be received into the Catholic Church? Well, when you study Oscar Wilde's life, it's not a surprise at all. It's actually, in many respects, it's the conclusion of his life, in both senses of the word. That which comes at the end, but that which follows is the conclusion he came to through the whole experience of his life. Oscar Wilde first became interested in Catholicism when he was an undergraduate at Trinity College in Dublin. And he fell under the influence of Cardinal Newman. And he had many priest friends. And he seemed to be on the verge of conversion as an undergraduate. Now, Oscar Wilde's father was horrified by this. And by way of trying to save him from the clutches of Rome, he found a way of getting his son sent to Oxford. Now, that was the equivalent of Oscar Wilde jumping from the frying pan into the fire. Because where was Newman's influence most strong? It wasn't in Dublin, it was in Oxford. Where was Newman received into the church? It wasn't in Dublin, it was in Oxford. What was the main movement of Anglo-Catholicism called within the Anglican Church? It was called the Oxford Movement. So basically, Wilde was moving into a far more Catholic environment at Magdalen College, Oxford, where he went to, than when he was at Trinity College, Dublin. And amongst the influences when he arrived there, as well as the lingering influence of Cardinal Newman, was the influence of John Ruskin and Walter Pater. Now, these were the two great Renaissance scholars of the 19th century, of the Victorian era, and they had two very different readings of what the Renaissance was. For John Ruskin, the Renaissance was the flowering of the whole medieval culture. It was the coming to fruition of Christendom, of Catholicism. And Ruskin talks about how this early Renaissance Catholic flowering decayed into a late Renaissance neo-paganism. He came up with a very memorable phrase about how Venice changed from being a medieval virgin to being a Renaissance Venus. And he talked about the various works of art that showed that change. For him, this was the decay of something beautiful. Now, his young rival, Walter Pater, agreed with a large part of that thesis, that yes, the Renaissance was a blooming, a blossoming, a flowering of this Christian culture, this Catholic Christianity of the Middle Ages. But that the decay, and he accepted it was a decay, but the decay was healthy. The decadence was healthy because it was a liberating of the Renaissance spirit from the shackles of Catholicism. I mean, that's putting things very, very bluntly, but one is basically very Catholic tradition-oriented, the other is very decadent. Wilde attended Ruskin's lectures. He fell under the influence of Walter Pater. He read Pater's History of the Renaissance, and particularly the introduction, which had a profound effect upon him. But it's clear in this debate, when you look at Oscar Wilde as an Oxford undergraduate, he sided very decidedly on the side of Ruskin, on the side of the traditionalist as against the decadent. And what you actually find in Oscar Wilde's work are these two fundamental forces at war. The moral dimension of Wilde's work is always this traditional, orthodox, Christian dimension. But the antagonist to that are these decadent ideas. So this conflict between Ruskin and Pater would have a lasting impact upon Wilde. But it's very interesting, if you read Wilde's correspondence and memoirs about Wilde as an undergraduate at Oxford, he sided very definitely on the side of tradition as against decadence. Further evidence of this is the fact that, again, in Oxford, Oscar Wilde came very close to converting to Catholicism. He kept pictures of photographs of Cardinal Manning and Pope Pius IX in his rooms in Oxford. Now, this is itself interesting because at that time there were, should we say, tensions in the church between the ultramontanes, those that supported the doctrine of papal infallibility, and the inopportunists, those who, such as Newman, who believed in papal infallibility but thought it was not the opportune time to define it dogmatically. And it's interesting that the two sides in this, Cardinal Manning was the leader. Of course, neither of them were cardinals at this time. We're going to get history correct. They both became cardinals. But Manning was the leader of the ultramontanes, those that were in favour of the declaration of papal infallibility. Newman was the leader of the inopportunists, those who thought it was not the right time to make that definition. It's interesting in that debate again, whose side does Oscar Wilde come down on? on the side of Cardinal Manning, the ultramontane leader of the traditional Catholics, if you like. And his other great hero, Pope Pius IX, who was actually a prisoner of the Vatican at this time, following Victor Emmanuel's march on Rome and taking of Rome, and the Pope was a prisoner, seen as a martyr against secularism. And Manning and Pius IX are Oscar Wilde's heroes as an undergraduate. In 1878, he meets Father Sebastian Bowden at the Brompton Oratory in London. Several of Wilde's friends had converted to Catholicism, and he had connections, and one of them was at the London Oratory, where Father Bowden was. Now, Father Bowden was known for being instrumental in high-profile society converts to Catholicism. He was a scholar. He was a person that was responsible for collecting the writings of Richard Simpson, who really did the groundwork for evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism, which was the subject of last year's lecture series, and my new book, The Quest for Shakespeare. A lot of it is based upon Richard Simpson's groundbreaking work in the Victorian period. Well, Father Bowden had gathered this material together and published it. He would also be responsible for receiving Chesterton's and Belloc's great friend Maurice Baring into the church quite a few years after this. So this great intellectual. And they had this meeting. Father Bowden wrote a letter, which I reprint at length in my book on Wilde. Really is a really perceptive insight into Wilde's psyche, into what motivates Wilde, basically predicting that Wilde either had to accept the grace of Christ, which had obviously been given him, that's what took him to Father Bowden in the first place, or he would basically have a serious downfall in his life later on. Very, very candid, uncompromising letter, which I'd say I won't publish. Now, the reason that Wilde didn't actually take the plunge was because his father made the ultimate threat of disinheriting him. If he became a Catholic, he would be disinherited. So this held Wilde back. His father died around this time. His mother's obviously still alive, no inheritance there, but Wilde's half-brother dies and leaves £2,000 to Wilde's brother and only £100 to Wilde, and also refused to give Wilde the house that he had a half share in, his half, because of Wilde's Catholicism, and made it clear in the will that if Wilde would have to not become a Catholic for the next 5 years in order to inherit this. So Wilde basically suffered financially for his flirtation with Rome, for his almost converting, and basically didn't become a Catholic because of this. He said as much a few weeks before he died in a newspaper interview, said that if his father had not prevented him from becoming a Catholic, he is sure that if he had become a Catholic then, that all of his later problems wouldn't have happened. Okay, so this is Wilde's almost becoming a Catholic as a young man. He then wanders away from that, though never actually leaves it, if you look at his work. Catholicism is always a presence in his life. An irritating one sometimes, an irritating one often, but it's always a presence. The one thing I also want to say at this juncture, to make perfectly clear, that one of the things that irritates me about a lot of these sensationalist biographies of Wilde that rejoice in his decadence, very one-sidedly and basing their thesis on errors, is that the real heroine and the real victim of the tragedy is passed over without a mention. And that's Constance Wilde, Oscar Wilde's wife, and his two sons. Because the reality of Wilde's lifestyle when he went into his decadent phase was he had been a very doting and loving father to his 2 young boys and to his wife, and basically started to neglect them all. And there's a really chilling story that's told of when Oscar Wilde basically starts living in hotels, doesn't go home at all to his wife or family. Constance Wilde turns up at the hotel room to deliver Wilde's mail and breaks down in tears and asks him when's she going to come home. And he responds heartlessly. Now, following the scandal in 1895, following the scandal, Constance Wilde had to go into exile with the children. She changed her name, and she predeceased Oscar Wilde. She died before he did, leaving basically their 2 sons parentless following Wilde's death. And yet in the midst of all of this, the great victim of sacrificed on Wilde's selfishness, basically, the sacrifice of Wilde's selfishness during this period, his wife Constance, never condemned Wilde as such. In fact, she said that Wilde is weak, not wicked. In spite of everything, she saw that it was his weakness. Now let's look, though, now, because it seems to me the heart of this paradox is that there are as many roads to Rome as there are people that go there. So you can't just talk about 2 paths to Rome. But it seems to me there are 2 main roads to Rome. There's the high road of sanctity and the low road of sin. Of course, even the saints are sinners, and even the sinners have their virtuous moments. So I don't want to make too much of a separating one from the other. But there's the path of sanctity, those who try to live a holy life and take the high road. I'm reminded of that Scottish song, which Loch Lomond, which I won't sing to you, but please to know, you take the high road, I'll take the low road, and I'll be a Scotland afore ye. Well, the high road taken by the saints, shall we say, and in this story, people like Newman and Manning that we've mentioned, and also people like Gerard Manley Hopkins, great poet of the 19th century, received into the church in 1866 by Newman, becomes arguably the finest poet of the Victorian period, and it also becomes a Jesuit priest. Now, they also had their temptations. Christ himself had his temptations, but for the most part, they walked the high road. And then you have the way of sin. If you like, we could say the Blessed Virgin path and the Mary Magdalene path. Now, Wilde is perhaps the most famous, at least in literary circles, convert to Catholicism who took the low road. But he's not by no means alone. And what I want to talk to you about briefly now as part of this picture is this whole decadent movement. Because on his honeymoon in Paris, Oscar Wilde read a book by a novelist called Joris Cole Huysmans. The novel was called À rebours, which is normally translated either as Against Nature or Against the Grain. And when you see the nature of this book, first thing I think about is the marriage is in trouble. When the best thing that Oscar Wilde can find to do on his honeymoon is to read this decadent novel. But this French connection, the influence of the French decadence on Oscar Wilde is phenomenal. And we need to look at the French decadent movement to understand Wilde and where he's coming from. And it's very interesting because Charles Baudelaire, the most famous of the French decadents, wrote a volume of poetry called Les Fleurs de Mal, the flowers of sickness, or the sick flowers, or the evil flowers, or however you want to translate it. And there was a French critic who, after reading Les Fleurs de Mal, said that after such blasphemies, the only thing left for Baudelaire was either the end of the nozzle of a gun or the foot of the cross. And Charles Baudelaire was received into the church shortly before his death. I'm not going to get involved in the whole thing, but I would say that there's an awful lot of good, solid Catholicism even in Les Fleurs de Mal, but not going to go there, no time. But then we have Paul Verlaine, the decadent poet. Now, he's even more outrageous in many ways than Oscar Wilde. He deserts his wife for a younger male lover. When the younger male lover leaves him for another younger male, he shoots his male lover. Doesn't kill him, but he shoots him, and he's sent to prison. I think for 2 years, but I can't remember that exactly. And while Paul Verlaine's in prison, he converts to Catholicism. And when he comes out of prison, he published a volume of poetry called Sagesse, Wisdom, which contains some fine, decadent Catholic poetry. Now, there might be some people in here that attempt to say, well, we don't need those sort of people converting, thank you very much. No, there are always the Pharisees amongst us. And then there's Joris Cole Huysmans, who was a novelist. He was the person who Wilde read on his honeymoon. His first novel, A Rebeu. Joris Cole Huysmans, this first novel, is all about someone who's so rich, the lead character, the main character in the novel, so wealthy, he can indulge every single whim and every single desire. He becomes an aesthete par excellence. An aesthetic extremist, if you like. He wants to experience every sensual pleasure that he can. All 5 senses. So there's long parts of the novel about his collection of perfumes. That he can get the experience of aromas. And obviously all the other sensual experiences you can imagine. He goes for all of these. So it's a decadent novel. Oscar Wilde says he was poisoned by that book. That book was the model for the book that in Wilde's novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. Dorian Gray had been poisoned by the book, the Yellow Book. It's based upon this novel by Joris Cole Huysmans. But how does that novel end? That novel ends with Des Esseintes, the protagonist, crying to heaven to a God that he doesn't even know exists. Because having lived an entirely selfish life in pursuit of the sensual only, he's empty. French word ennui. Bored, empty, unsatisfied. We need to remember that the word satisfaction comes from the Latin word satis, meaning enough. Now, if one is only intent on indulging one's sensual appetites, one never has enough. By definition, one is never satisfied. That's why the great prophet of the 1960s was Mick Jagger. I can't get no satisfaction. It's a message which is not only negative, but double negative. So at the end of this novel, what do we see? You try to do this, you live this life of self-indulgence, where does it lead you? It leads you to emptiness, to boredom, to despair, and to a cry to an unknown God for deliverance. And that's a novel that's called decadent. Well, it is decadent, but its moral is not decadent. Its moral is Christian. And we should have guessed from that first novel where Huysmans was going. Huysmans' next book was called Là-bas, Down There. And down there means hell. And the protagonist in that novel gets himself involved with the Satanists in modern-day Paris. And the novel ends with an horrific depiction of the Black Mass that I'm not suggesting any of you read, because I don't take the blame for it if you do. It's a great novel, though, so that might tempt you. But it is shocking. But again, at the end, what happens when the protagonist ends up this far in hell on earth? He recoils in horror and in disgust. So the next novel in the series with the same character is called En route. And en route is because he's en route to the Catholic Church. And the novel after that is called La Cathédrale, the Cathedral, where he's received into the Catholic Church. Joris Cole Huysmans spends the last years of his life in a monastery. So the three key figures of the French decadent movement, Baudelaire, Verlaine, and Huysmans, all convert to Catholicism. When Wilde gets out of prison, before that, Wilde hears earlier that Huysmans had entered a monastery. Wilde's response was entirely positive, and he said, I hope to be able to do the same myself one day. Now, to what extent that's Wilde posturing and posing, we don't know, but there's certainly an element of truth there. And when he came out of prison, he wanted to go on a long retreat with the Jesuits at Farm Street. That's Oscar Wilde. So this French, in my book on Oscar Wilde, this is called The French Connection, the chapter about the French decadence and the influence upon Oscar Wilde. I'm reading that novel on his honeymoon and the influence of Baudelaire, etc. So we have these decadent ideas entering in Oscar Wilde, and the thing that confuses people about Oscar Wilde, two things. First of all, if you pick up a dictionary of quotations, you'll have all sorts of quotes about decadent, outrageous quotes, just says Oscar Wilde. Now, I can resist everything except temptation, for instance. But of course, most of these iconoclastic statements are not by Wilde at all, for the most part. Some of them are. But for the most part, they're by characters in his plays and in his novel that are depicted as evil characters who actually, in the denouement of the plot, get their comeuppance. They come undone. The hero or heroine wins out over these horrible characters. There's a parallel story which I'll resist telling you, I think. That the motto to my hideous school I went to in England, above the auditorium, was, "This above all to thine own self be true." William Shakespeare. Right, now, it took me years to realize that "this above all to thine own self be true," which of course is a nice relativist motto, was the words actually said by Polonius in Hamlet, who's a complete buffoon, who gets himself killed because he's a complete buffoon, and his advice to his son, where that comes from, ends up getting his son killed. But it's William Shakespeare that said it, not Polonius. But it's the same. Oscar Wilde is the victim of the same misquotation or quotation abuse, if you like. Wilde's most pernicious work is not his art, which he always says is where what he wants to be read and the medium through which he expresses himself and reveals himself, but his criticism. And it's in Wilde's critical essays that the harmful Wilde is to be seen. In essays such as The Critic as Artist, Decay of Lying, Pen, Pencil and Poison, etc. Now these are manifestations of Wilde's confusion at the time. Bear in mind, at this time he's living a double life. He's a husband and father, but now involved with the homosexual world in London. He's living a duplicitous life. He's betraying his wife and children, and this is sort of some way of trying to turn morality inside out, to invert morality to somehow justify, well, what's good is evil and what evil is good. But in his art, Oscar Wilde always comes out against such nonsense. For instance, his play, A Woman of No Importance. The critic, and these pernicious views in his criticism are always revealed and exposed as being poisonous in his plays and in his fiction. The critic in that play is Lord Illingworth. Mrs. Arbuthnot is the heroine. Lord Illingworth is this pernicious, poisonous critic. Even the name, Ill-worth. The Woman of No Importance was the irony of the title. It's really about the critic of no importance. In The Picture of Dorian Gray, Basil Hallward is the artist. Lord Henry Wotton is the critic. And Dorian Gray is guilty of art as idolatry. And the critic a cynic. And of course, if you want to read Wilde's postmodern critics, they're always quoting from the preface, one particular part of the preface. There's no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. But when The Picture of Dorian Gray was attacked for being an immoral book for its allusions to homosexuality, Wilde said, on the contrary, the book's weakness is its moral is too obvious. The moral is basically given by Lord Henry Wotton when he says, by the way, Dorian, what does it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his soul? Dorian Gray is horrified when he hears that, and he says, don't mock. I know that the soul is a real thing. It can be bought, bartered, sold away. And of course he knows that because the picture is indeed the mirror of his own soul. Wilde says that the moral of that book is when you kill your conscience, when you try to kill your conscience, you kill yourself. And then, of course, in 1592, we have the prison sentence, or we have the trials. And Wilde is seen as by the modern world as as a sexual liberator, as a martyr to the homosexual lifestyle. Let's actually see what happens here. What actually happened, no one was going to arrest Oscar Wilde for his homosexual lifestyle. He was wrecking his marriage, he was betraying his children. No one was going to arrest him. No one was interested in Wilde's private life. Except the father of the young man who Wilde was dallying with, who obviously took parental concern. He's vilified by Wilde's biographers. And he left a card in Wilde's club to Oscar Wilde posing as a sodomite. And Oscar Wilde sued the Marquis of Queensberry, Lord Alfred Douglas' father, for libel. For making that claim, just in the card in his club. Well, private detectives are hired, and loads of evidence is shown that Oscar Wilde is not only posing as a sodomite, he's practicing as one. Therefore, the Marquis of Queensberry is acquitted of libel. Well, at this point, of course, there's a whole load of evidence that's been collected, that's on record in a court case. It leaves the authorities with no option, but to charge Wilde with the offence, which is an illegal offence. No one was hunting him down, no one was spying on him. He basically shot himself in the foot. So we send this to prison, and the real tragedy is that this prison sentence is, this scandal surrounding it is all we really hear about Oscar Wilde now. You know, you see the fairly recent film on Wilde, starring Stephen Fry, who's done some excellent things, but it was all about this aspect, this sort of aspect of Wilde's life, not about his art. And the irony is here that in De Profundis, this letter which I said really shows Wilde stripped down, no masks, Wilde refers to his homosexuality as his pathology, as his sickness. Now, in today's world, Wilde will not only not be a homosexual liberator, if he lived in Canada or Scandinavia, he'd be put in prison. Because it's illegal to say that now. It's a hate crime. So Oscar Wilde, far from being a homosexual liberator, could be called a homophobe. But Wilde's experience of prison was not so much a hell as a purgatory. It brought him to a self-realization, which we see expressed not only in De Profundis, the letter he wrote while he was in prison, but also in his poem, The Ballad of Reading Gaol, where the memorable lines, "How else but through a broken heart may Lord Christ enter in?" So when Wilde was received into the Catholic Church on his deathbed, if you actually look at his work, his novel, at his plays, if you look at his life, his attraction to the Catholic Church, it's not actually that much of a surprise. But even more, he's following in the footsteps of his French predecessors, Baudelaire, Verlaine and Huysmans. But look at the other leading members of the decadent movement in England, of whom Wilde was the leader. Robert Ross, The man who most biographers seem to think was the person that introduced Wilde to homosexual practices becomes a Catholic and also stays loyal to Wilde throughout everything. He's the one that's there, the only person there when Wilde's dying in poverty in Paris. He becomes a Catholic. John Gray, the young man who is supposed to be so physically beautiful that he's alleged to be the model for Wilde's Dorian Gray. Well, John Gray not only becomes a Catholic, he goes off to Rome, studies for the priesthood at the English College, becomes a Catholic priest, and serves his parish in Edinburgh in Scotland, and lives to old age, unlike most of the decadents who, for one reason or another, die young. Andrei Rafalovich, great friend of John Gray's, becomes a Catholic. Ernest Dowson, arguably the greatest of the decadent poets, becomes a Catholic. Aubrey Beardsley, very influential artist who illustrated Wilde's play Salome when it was published. Died very young. I think he was only 24 years old when he died. But he became a Catholic. Lionel Johnson, the other great decadent poet of the 1890s, became a Catholic. Even Lord Alfred Douglas, the young man who Wilde became involved with, that led to his downfall, the homosexual relationship, even Lord Alfred Douglas becomes a Catholic, and unlike many of these, lives to a good, healthy old age. Remains a Catholic to the end. So this low road isn't something really strange that few people take. This Mary Magdalene path is a path which you actually look at the decadent movements in France and in England. The paradox is that this path can lead to Christ. It's a dangerous path, and you carry on going down, it leads to the other place altogether. Not a path we should necessarily recommend anybody takes. But what actually happens, of course, when you live this lifestyle, you either get completely sucked in, it chews you up, spits you out, and that's it, or it's like taking a step into hell, realizing that hell really exists, and like the character in Huysman's novel, recoil in horror from it into the arms of Mother Church. And I want to finish with a modern example. Some of you may have heard of the English writer and broadcaster Malcolm Muggeridge. And Malcolm Muggeridge reverted to Catholicism largely through filming a film documentary on Mother Teresa called Something Beautiful for God. And the influence of seeing Mother Teresa in action was the final thing that converted Malcolm Muggeridge. But Malcolm Muggeridge had lived a very decadent lifestyle, a very selfish lifestyle. One of the great miracles of 20th century literature, literary people, is how the Muggeridge marriage ever survived. Because his wife stayed with him in spite of he was a serial fornicator, to use an unfashionable term, but an accurate one. His wife had one affair, I think, just in spite, but realised she didn't like it and didn't do it again. He had many. Somehow or other they stayed together. And in 1982, when Muggeridge was 78 years old, he becomes a Catholic. And he lives for a further 8 years as a Catholic. He dies in 1990. But at the press conference in England, after he was received into the church, this journalist stood up and said, "Now, Mr. Muggeridge, I don't resent or begrudge you becoming a Catholic. You know, you're 78 years old. But you basically you lived a life of indulgence, self-indulgence. You did all the things when you were young that now you become a Catholic, you're telling us we're not allowed to do. You know, isn't it rather easy to say that when you're 78 years old? You know, do you regret all those good times you had when you were younger?" And Muggeridge laughed. He's got the humour of the situation. When he responded to did he regret his sins, he said he regretted, certainly, the people that he harmed and hurted through his sinful actions, obviously thinking largely of his wife. In other words, don't forget the hidden cost of this freedom. But he said, you know, the most important thing is how one's life ends. He said, every man's life is a passion play. And we have passions. We have illicit passions that we're obviously supposed to control. But often we don't. Sometimes we don't. Malcolm Muggeridge said, if my sins, learning from my sins, being repentant for my sins, lead me to the foot of the cross, knowing that I had nailed him there because of my sins, then that's a happy ending. And I can't regret the path that led me to the foot of the cross. And there's a paradox, fit for Wilde or Chesterton. Every man's life is a passion play. The key issue is, how does it end? So on that basis, and this is to be controversial, because I know some people will think it's not fair, the most important thing is that Wilde's life ends happily. Wilde's life, being received into the church shortly before his death, had a happy ending. We might even hope that, like the Happy Prince in one of his many delightful Christian fairy stories, he is living happily ever after. Thank you. Do you want questions? Isn't there a Pharisee in the audience?
I wanted to ask you, why do you think he would actually attempt to sue for something that was true in terms of libel? Since he knew his lifestyle, why did he go to court when he knew the evidence was out there that he was in fact a sodomite?
Well, most biographers agree that he was largely prompted to do so by Lord Alfred Douglas, who hated his father. And it was basically Wilde doing what his, one of a better word, boyfriend wanted. And I think that's certainly largely true. But also, yeah, you have to think, Wilde didn't know that there was any evidence. I mean, he thought he was being discreet. And he certainly didn't think that the Marquis of Queensberry would hire private detectives to follow people and get statements from male prostitutes and what have you. So, you know, it was naive. But ill-judged. But, you know, ultimately he had no cause for complaining when it was obviously proved that there was no libel. In fact, he wasn't posing, he was. So, yeah.
I'd be interested to know specifically what was the place of satire in his work, and then what would be the connection between his satire and the Catholic point of view you were talking about. That was a part of his life in some way for his whole life. So how is that influencing his satire? Where would that come? I'm not exactly sure myself.
Right. The first problem there, I think, is how are we going to define satire? So I'm not going to go there now, it would take too long. But if we're going to define it in a way that we can call Wilde a satirist, because if we defined it another way, he wouldn't be a satirist. Certainly, the bulk of Wilde's work is a satire on his times, and on particularly on both the prurience, of which he's now a victim, and the Puritanism, of which he's now a victim. The hypocrisy of Victorian Puritanism, on the one hand, is always being satirized by Wilde, but also the hypocrisy and destructiveness of the anti-puritanical cynicism of pessimistic philosophers, those in the school of Schopenhauer, for instance. These sort of ideas are being, for the purposes of this discussion, I would call satirized in Wilde's plays and in his novel. So if you actually read Wilde's work, all of it is really in a dialogue and a condemnation of those aspects of Victorian England. And that certainly could be called satire. Yeah.
Knowing a bit of seeing that Wilde was so much of an aesthete, how much his perception of Catholicism was colored by a certain aesthetic, and comparatively also to see his attraction to Catholicism in comparison maybe with someone like Chesterton or even Waugh, who apparently had no aesthetic, who found no aesthetic appeal in Catholicism.
Okay. And let me try to answer that. First of all, of course, the Catholicism properly understood is the union of fides et ratio, which is the good, the true, and the beautiful. So to try to separate those is an error, not your error, but and it's a danger. And certainly Oscar Wilde, when we see his approach to Catholicism when he was a young man, it's much more an aesthetic approach. It's the beauty, but it's not just the beauty of, we easily dismiss it just, swinging incense and beautiful choirs. It's the beauty of the story of Christ's life. It's the beauty of the symbolism of the crucifixion. It's the beauty of the symbolism of the resurrection. So that aestheticism is there. But there certainly is a danger that you see the beauty to the detriment of the rational. And I think it's a fair criticism of Wilde that he had that tendency. I would say, with Chesterton, by the way, I think Chesterton had a correct balance between the good, the true, and the beautiful. The other interesting thing is many of Chesterton's early works are a reaction against Wilde's aestheticism and decadence. And The Man Who Was Thursday, for instance, if you read... An ideal thing that I would suggest you do at some stage is to read the Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde and read The Man Who Was Thursday immediately afterwards, because the one is largely a response to the other. And Evelyn Waugh, as one who was very unhappy with the liturgical changes in the 1960s, I think it would be an oversimplification, even if Waugh himself said so, that Waugh had no aesthetic sensibility. Because if he had no aesthetic sensibility, he wouldn't care anything about the liturgy, presumably. So I think he had his own aesthetic side, but I think you're probably getting what you're saying from the fact that both Chesterton and Waugh made it perfectly clear they didn't come into Catholicism because of the beauty, they came into it because of the philosophy. And I think that's true. I think it was mainly a rational conversion for both Waugh and Chesterton, but that's not to say there's not an aesthetic aspect. Okay.
Their heads when they looked at the morality of the Picture of Dorian Gray and some of Wilde's other works versus his very public, decadent lifestyle. They seem so much at odds with each other, or did they not understand the kind of satire of Dorian Gray, or what was the dynamic there?
Well, there's a conflict there, and that's one of the things I try to get to grips with in my book, that even in Oscar Wilde himself there's a conflict. But the point is that when he's actually expressing himself artistically, he's always on the side of the morally good and always critical of this decadent lifestyle and this decadent philosophy, which means that Wilde is aware that he's living a double life and knows which side is the right side and which side is the wrong side. So the key thing is that Wilde has a conscience, and the conscience actually is guiding him correctly. But he's also, I think his wife knew him well. He's not so much wicked as weak. And, he took the path of least resistance far too often. And that got him into all sorts of trouble. So that I think is the key element. But he always knew right from wrong, and his instincts were correct there. He was a Christian in that sense.
But, sorry, did the people who read his books not see him as this icon, or the people who followed him as an icon not read his books?
Well, yeah. Basically, the court case in 1892, the court case in 1892 came as a complete shock to most people. Now, Wilde was seen as, being a wit who sometimes had a wicked edge to his wit, but it was seen as being flippant and frivolous. They were shocked when this court case happened. No one was aware that he was living this lifestyle until then. And basically, Wilde wrote next to nothing after that. So, when Wilde was writing his works, people were unaware of this double life. We should also say, by the way, this double life only lasted for a few years. For most of the time he was writing, he wasn't living this lifestyle. It's the last few years. But he wrote some very powerful stuff during those years, however.
A lot of your seems to rest on the strength of the moral character of literature. But thinking of England in those times, was there as big a market for decadent literature in England? Isn't this the way he supported himself? Could it be he wrote that kind of literature because it was his way of supporting himself?
That's certainly one way of saying it, but you have to take Wilde at his own word, and I say the words in De Profundis, I think, are honest, because he's running for one person, for no money, in a place where everything's been stripped from him. And he says, you know what my art was to me, the way in which I revealed myself, first to myself, and then myself to the world. So I'm merely taking Wilde at his word there. My other thing, by the way, is that I'm also effectively going against the major biographies of Wilde that sort of assume that he's messed up like this because he has syphilis. I mean, Richard Ellman in his so-called definitive biography builds his whole case on this. And I show in my book that he didn't have syphilis, and we can prove he didn't have syphilis. On 2 occasions, he was actually examined by doctors who were specialists in sexually transmitted diseases, and he certainly didn't have it. So, in other words, the whole edifice of Wilde scholarship is built upon fallacious foundations. So my book is ultimately trying to say, well, okay, with all that's wrong, let's start see what's right. And that's the unmasking of Oscar Wilde, to get rid of this and try to find the real man. Okay, I'll take one more question, because I think some people are obviously, hoping to leave, and some have left, and some are too polite to leave. The Englishmen amongst you are still sitting there, looking at your clocks, watch yourself surreptitiously, because you mustn't be polite. In England, by the way, one of the reasons the English is such a mess these days is only one commandment: thou shalt not be impolite. So the Englishmen out there sort of surreptitiously looking at their watches, hoping I'm going to finish. So I am going to finish, because I also don't believe in being impolite. So I'll take one more question if there is one, and then we'll conclude. Yes.
Why is he seen by so many, or maybe a better way to put this, why is it that these biographers to whom you're responding are so desperate to show that the words in De Profundis are syphilitic? Why is there this need to have him be an emblem of gay rights?
Well, that people are trying to turn Wilde into a mythical creature that bears no relationship to the real man or the real work. So, and we also live in an age of postmodern nihilism where, looking for an objective rationale, an objective reason is not that important. So they invent something which is a myth. I mean, Ellman sort of, I think the most obscene one, the most absurd one was actually Melissa Knox wrote a book called Oscar Wilde's Long and Lovely Suicide. And her whole thesis was that Wilde had syphilis. But by the time she wrote this, that had been debunked largely. And she said, well, Wilde may not have had syphilis, but he believed he had syphilis. And therefore, this is the reason for everything. Because there's no evidence in writing anywhere else that he believed he had syphilis. So he didn't have it, but he believed he did. But then she still says that basically, later in the book, that he'd given it to his wife and to his children. So is imaginary syphilis contagious? To which I would say only amongst Wilde's critics. Thank you very much.
Don't forget the series concludes 2 weeks from now, same time, same place, when Brother Charlie Gordon delivers a lecture on evil and law. And 2 of Professor Pearce's most recent books are available outside for purchase. Thank you all for coming.